The promise of ruin had a particular scent in the Night Kingdom: cold stone, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of bloodless ceremony. Ilara smelled it on the air of the throne room, a vast cavern of polished obsidian that drank the light from the high, narrow windows and gave nothing back. It was a cold that had little to do with the mountain air outside and everything to do with the silent, immaculate figures lining the hall. They were statues carved from malice, their stillness a predator's patience. At their head, on a throne that seemed forged from a fallen star, sat the king. Kaelin. He watched her. That was the singular, unbearable cruelty of it all. He did not look away. His eyes, the color of a twilight sky just before the stars emerge, held her pinned in the center of the geometric patterns on the floor. They were the same eyes that had once traced the line of her throat with a reverence that felt like worship, the same eyes that had softened with a light she had mistaken for love. Now, they were merely the eyes of a king, distant and unreadable, watching a political necessity unfold. The elder, Lycoris, spoke the words of judgment, her voice a dry rustle of ancient parchment. For the crime of bearing mortal frailty within these sacred walls, for the impurity of a sun-born heart that can never truly know the glory of the eternal night, the council decrees exile. Each word was a stone dropped into the profound silence of the hall. Ilara stood straight, a discipline she had learned in this court of rigid spines. She would not give them the satisfaction of her collapse. Her hands were bound before her, not with iron, but with silken cords enchanted to feel as heavy as chains. It was a typical flourish of the night court cruelty disguised as aesthetics. She kept her gaze fixed on Kaelin. She willed him to see past the mortal woman the council condemned. She willed him to remember the scent of rain in her hair, the sound of her laughter in the walled garden, the warmth of her skin beneath his impossibly cool hands. She willed him to remember the life nestled beneath her heart, a secret they had whispered about in the dark, a fragile, impossible hope that was as much his as it was hers. His heir. Their child. He knew. She was certain he knew. The faint, almost imperceptible widening of his eyes when Lycoris had spoken of impurity was the only sign, a flicker of emotion so minuscule that anyone else would have missed it. But she had spent months learning the geography of his face, the subtle tectonics of his expressions. He knew, and he was doing nothing. He was letting them do this. He was letting them cast her out, and with her, their unborn child. The silence that followed the decree stretched, becoming a physical presence in the room. It was a canvas onto which Ilara painted 1,000 unsent screams. Look at me. Say something. This is your child. Our child. Her thoughts were a frantic, silent prayer aimed at the unmoving figure on the throne. His stillness was his answer. It was a decision, as clear and sharp as the executioner's axe. He chose his crown. He chose his court of whispering shadows and ancient hatreds. He chose the sterile, eternal safety of his kingdom over the messy, vibrant, and dangerous promise of a future with her. With them. 2 guards, their faces as impassive as their king's, stepped forward. Their movements were fluid, silent. They took her by the arms, their touch gentle but absolute. As they began to lead her away, past the rows of silent vampires whose collective animosity felt like a physical force, she allowed herself one last, desperate look at Kaelin. His expression had not changed. He remained a perfect, beautiful sculpture of a king, his face a mask of regal indifference. But she saw it, or perhaps, in her desperation, she imagined it. A fissure in the marble. A tremor in the line of his jaw. The barest clenching of his hand on the arm of his throne, the knuckles of his long fingers turning white. It was nothing. It was everything. It was not enough. They led her from the throne room, through corridors that seemed to leach the very warmth from her blood. The great doors at the end of the hall swung open, revealing not the familiar dark halls of the citadel, but the raw, biting wind of the mountain pass. The border. Beyond it lay the Sunlands, the mortal realms he had sworn she would never have to see again. The guards released her at the edge of the precipice. The sun was beginning to rise, a sliver of painful, brilliant gold slicing through the perpetual gloom of the mountain peaks. It was a dawn she had once loved, but now it felt like an accusation. The light touched her face, and for the first time in months, it felt alien. She did not look back. To look back would be to see the closed doors, to confirm the finality of it. Instead, she wrapped her arms around her stomach, a small, protective gesture. The child within her was quiet, a tiny, secret spark against the overwhelming cold. I will keep you safe, she thought, the vow a burning coal in her chest. I will raise you in the sun. And you will never know the man who chose a throne over his own blood. She turned and began the long walk down the mountain, leaving the kingdom of eternal night behind her. She did not know that from the highest window of the citadel, a solitary figure watched her go, his silhouette a slash of black against the grey stone, until she was nothing more than a speck swallowed by the vast, indifferent light of a world he could never touch. He stood there long after she was gone, a king in a kingdom of one, his reign already tasting of ash. 20 years later, the sun beat down on the training grounds of Oakhaven, the capital city of the Sunlands. It was a light that baked the earth hard and bleached the banners that snapped in the hot, dry wind. Here, the scent of ruin was different. It smelled of sweat, steel, and the simmering fear of the raids that came with every new moon. For 2 decades, the border skirmishes with the Night Kingdom had grown bolder, more frequent, the vampires testing the human defenses like a predator probing the strength of a cage. In the center of the dusty yard stood Alaric. He moved with a grace that was at once beautiful and terrifying, a blur of controlled motion. His practiced sword, a heavy piece of blunted steel that would exhaust an ordinary man in minutes, seemed an extension of his arm. He parried, spun, and lunged, his body a living weapon. His sparring partners, 3 of the best soldiers in the Oakhaven Guard, could barely keep up. There was an otherness to him, and everyone knew it. It was in the unnatural speed that left opponents striking at empty air. It was in the strength that could dent a steel helmet with a careless backhand. It was in his eyes, the color of twilight, a strange, unsettling violet gray that seemed to see more than a mortal man's should. He was the child of the sun, born and raised in its warmth, yet he carried a piece of the night within him. His mother, Elara, had never told him the whole truth. She spoke of the night court in hushed, pained whispers, describing a place of cold beauty and colder hearts. She spoke of a king she had once known, but her stories were fragmented, veiled in a grief so profound that Alaric had learned from a young age not to press for details. He knew only this: they had wronged her. They had cast her out, broken and alone, and for that, there could be no forgiveness. He disarmed the last of his partners with a flick of his wrist, the man's sword spinning into the dust. Alaric offered a hand, pulling the winded soldier to his feet with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his strange, old eyes. "Your footwork is improving, Jorik," he said, his voice calm and even. "But you telegraph your thrust. Think with the point of the blade, not with your shoulder." Jorik nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Easy for you to say, Commander. You move like a ghost." Alaric's smile tightened. A ghost. A shadow. He'd heard it all his life. He was their protector, their champion, the Sunstone Commander they called him, yet he knew he would always be separate. They respected him, they followed him, but they did not truly understand him. How could they? He barely understood himself. His own body was a constant source of wonder and alienation. He healed too quickly, felt the pull of the moon in his blood, and craved the cool of the evening with a thirst that went beyond simple relief from the day's heat. He found his mother in the gardens behind their small stone house, her hands tending to the moon-petal flowers that only bloomed after dusk. She looked older now, the years of hardship and heartache having etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. But her spirit, the quiet, resilient strength that had carried them through everything, remained undimmed. She looked up as he approached, her smile warm and genuine. It was the one place he never felt like an outsider. "The council is meeting again," he said, sitting on the stone bench beside her. "Another village attacked near the Shadowfell Pass. 3 dead. Livestock drained." Elara's hands stilled, her knuckles white as she gripped her small trowel. She didn't need to ask who was responsible. "It's getting worse." "It's been getting worse for years," Alaric countered, his voice tight with a familiar frustration. "We defend. We rebuild. We wait for them to strike again. It's a cycle of survival, not a strategy for victory. What else can we do, my son? They are immortal. We are not." Her voice was weary, filled with the resignation of someone who had seen the monster up close and knew its power. "We can fight back," Alaric said, the words coming out with a force that surprised even him. "Not just defend the border. We can take the fight to them. We can push them back from the foothills, secure the passes. We can show them that the Sunlands are no longer their private hunting ground." Ilara turned to look at him, her expression clouded with a fear he had seen 1,000 times before. It was a fear that was not for herself, but for him. "You speak of war, Alaric." "I speak of an end to being prey," he corrected softly. He looked at her, at the deep, old wound she carried so silently. His entire life had been shaped by that wound. His strength, his speed, his relentless drive to protect these people, it all stemmed from a need to rectify a wrong he couldn't even name. He was the answer to a question his mother would never ask. "They cannot be allowed to hurt anyone else. Not like they hurt you." Her face softened, and she reached out, her hand tracing the line of his jaw. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes were filled with a terrible sorrow. "Oh, my child," she whispered. "You have his face. The same pride. The same fire." She had never said it so plainly before. "Be careful that it does not consume you as it did him." He didn't know whose face she saw, what ghost she was speaking to. He knew only the faces of the dead villagers, the fear in the eyes of the border patrols, and the quiet, unending pain in his mother's. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the cycle had to be broken. He would be the one to break it. He would lead an army into the twilight, and he would face the king of that cold, dark land. He would demand a reckoning for the life that was stolen from his mother, never knowing he was marching to face his own reflection, to demand justice from his own father. The throne room had not changed in 20 years. It was as Kaelan remembered it from the day of the exile, and as it had been for the 5 centuries of his reign, a monument to stillness, to permanence. The obsidian floor still swallowed the light, the air was still cold with the weight of ages. Only he was different. The silence that had once been a symbol of his power now felt like a tomb. The solitude he had cultivated as a necessity of kingship had become a slow, wasting poison. He sat on his throne, the obsidian seat, and held a single, withered flower in his hand. A moon petal. It had been culled from the abandoned garden, the one place in the citadel he still allowed to grow wild. Her garden. The petals were as dry and fragile as ancient paper, their scent long since faded. Yet, he remembered it. He remembered everything. He remembered the shock on Ilara's face, the betrayal that had ripped the light from her eyes. He remembered the feel of her pulse beneath his thumb, a frantic, living rhythm that had been an anchor in his sea of endless, unchanging years. And he remembered the moment, weeks before the exile, when he had first sensed it, a second, fainter pulse within her, a tiny, impossible spark of life. A Dampier. A half-breed. His child. The prophecy had been whispered in the deepest vaults of the citadel for 1,000 years. When the sun-born blood mingles with the night, a child shall come who will be the kingdom's ruin. His council, led by the ancient and cunning Lycoris, had feared it, had used it as a tool to maintain their rigid purity. When they discovered Ilara's presence, her influence over him, they saw the prophecy's shadow looming. They did not know about the child, not for certain, but they suspected. Their calls for her removal had grown from whispers to demands. He could have refused them. He was the king. He could have slaughtered the entire council and remade the court in his own image. But the rot was too deep. The fear of the prophecy was woven into the very fabric of their society. To protect Ilara and the child within the court would have been to paint a target on them. They would have become prisoners, objects of fear and superstition, their every move watched. And if the truth of the child's nature was ever revealed, not even his power could have saved them from the ensuing chaos. Assassins would have come not just from his own court, but from rival vampire clans who would see the child as an abomination or a weapon. So he had made an impossible choice. He had orchestrated the exile. He had worn the mask of a cold, indifferent king, letting her believe he had abandoned her. It was the cruelest thing he had ever done, and the only act of love he knew how to give. He sent her away to save her. He broke her heart to keep it beating. He gave up his child so that his child might live, free, in the sun. Every day for 20 years, He had lived with the echoes of that choice. He had ruled a kingdom that felt hollow, its immortality a curse of endless repetition. He had watched his court grow more stagnant, more insular, their fear of change calcifying them into living fossils. He had sent out spies, of course. For years, he received discreet reports. A woman of her description settling in Oakhaven. The birth of a son. A boy who grew with uncanny speed and strength. A young man who became a protector, a leader. His son. Alaric. A chamberlain entered the throne room, his steps silent on the polished floor. "My king," he murmured, bowing low. A report from the border scouts in the Shadowfell. Kaelin did not look up from the withered flower. "Speak. The human commander, the one they call the Sunstone, has retaliated for the last raid. He led a company of soldiers into the pass. They did not retreat. They advanced." The chamberlain hesitated. Lord Valerus and his coven engaged them. Lord Valerus did not return. Kaelin's fingers tightened, and the dried moon petal crumbled into dust. Valerus was 200 years old, a seasoned and ruthless warrior. For him to fall to a human commander was unheard of. The commander himself fought Valerus, the chamberlain continued, his voice barely a whisper. The scouts who escaped said he moved faster than their eyes could follow. They said his strength was unnatural. They said he fought with the fury of a zealot and the strategy of a centuries-old general. Kaelin slowly raised his head, his twilight eyes fixing on the chamberlain, who flinched under the intensity of his gaze. And his appearance. This Sunstone commander. Dark hair, my king. Tall. And his eyes. The scouts were most unnerved by his eyes. They said they were the color of dusk. The king's face remained a mask, but inside his chest, something that had been dormant for 2 decades stirred. A terrible, agonizing mixture of pride and dread. The fury of a zealot. He was fighting for his mother. The strategy of a general. He was fighting with his father's blood. The prophecy was coming true, but not in the way anyone had imagined. The ruin was not coming from within. It was marching towards him, leading a human army, wearing his face. He is gathering the militias from the western towns, the chamberlain added. They are amassing an army in Oakhaven. The humans are speaking of war. They mean to invade. Kaelin rose from the throne, the dust of the flower falling from his hand. The silence of the room felt different now, charged with anticipation. The long, stagnant peace was over. The consequences of his choice, made 20 years ago out of a desperate, twisted love, were finally coming home. He had sent his son away to save him from this dark, suffocating world. And now, his son was coming back to destroy it. A small, bitter smile touched Kaelin's lips. Perhaps ruin was not an ending, but a transformation. "Let them come," Kaelin said, his voice quiet but resonating with an ancient power that made the very stones seem to vibrate. "I will meet this commander myself." He walked away from the throne, leaving the chamberlain trembling in his wake. For the first time in 20 years, the king of the Night Kingdom felt something other than regret. He felt a flicker of something that might have been fear, or might have been hope. They felt terrifyingly the same. The village of Silver Creek was a scar on the landscape, a still smoldering wound. The scent of burnt thatch and old blood hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud woven by the night's horrors. Alaric walked through the ruins, his boots crunching on charred wood and shattered pottery. This was what had tipped the balance. The raids had always been brutal, a culling of livestock, a person taken here and there. But this was an extermination. Huts burned to the ground, the well poisoned with vampire blood, bodies left in the open, not fed upon, but torn apart. It was a message. A display of contempt. He knelt by the small, broken form of a child, no older than 7. Her hand was still clutching a carved wooden bird. He had seen enough death to last a lifetime, but the casual, pointless cruelty of this act ignited a cold, pure rage in his heart. It was a rage that burned away all doubt, all hesitation. His mother's quiet pain was an abstract sorrow. This was a visceral, undeniable truth. The Night Kingdom was a cancer, and he would be the surgeon's knife. He stood, his twilight eyes sweeping over the faces of his soldiers and the terrified survivors who had gathered around him. He saw their fear, their grief, their desperation. And he saw them looking to him, their sunstone commander, for an answer, for hope. They did this to show us we are weak, Alaric's voice rang out, clear and sharp in the funereal silence. It was not the voice of a politician, but of a warrior. They did this to remind us that we are their cattle, to be slaughtered at their whim. They believe the sun that warms our skin makes us fragile. They believe the blood in our veins is nothing more than their wine. He drew his sword, the blade forged with a core of sun-blessed silver, a craft perfected over generations of defense. It shone with a clean, righteous light against the grey, ashen backdrop. For 20 years, we have hidden behind our walls. We have patched our defenses and mourned our dead. We have lived by the rules of the predator, hoping the beast would be satisfied with a few scraps. But the beast is never satisfied. Its hunger is eternal. He paused, letting his gaze fall on each person, forging a connection, a shared purpose. I say, no more. No more hiding. No more waiting for the next attack. The time for defense is over. The time has come to hunt the hunters. A murmur went through the crowd, a spark of something fierce and hopeful igniting in the ashes of their despair. They are immortal, he continued, his voice rising, but they are not invincible. They burn in the light of the sun that gives us life. They are few, and we are many. They have grown arrogant in their eternal night, complacent in their power. They will not expect us. They will not believe we have the courage to march into their shadows. He raised his sword higher, its point aimed north, towards the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, the grim barrier between the worlds of sun and night. We will take the fight to them. We will march to the very gates of their dark kingdom. We will tear down the walls of our fear and build a new future from the stones. For Silver Creek. For every life they have stolen. For the Sunlands. A single voice, raw with grief, shouted back, for the Sunlands. Then another, and another, until it became a roar, a wave of human defiance washing over the devastation. It was the sound of fear turning to anger, of victims becoming warriors. In that moment, Alaric was no longer just a commander. He was an embodiment of their collective will. The otherness that had always set him apart now became his greatest asset. His unnatural strength was their shield, his preternatural senses their guiding star. He was the bridge, the one who could walk into the twilight and not be consumed. The days that followed were a blur of frenetic activity. Messengers rode out, carrying Alaric's call to arms to every town and holding in the Sunlands. Militias, once disparate and disorganized, began to converge on Oakhaven. Farmers arrived with pitchforks and hunting bows, blacksmiths worked day and night forging silver-cord weapons, and old soldiers who hadn't seen a real battle in years strapped on their worn leather armor. Alaric was the center of the storm, his energy tireless. He drilled the troops, his strange speed and insight transforming clumsy farmers into a cohesive fighting force. He planned their route, his mind seeing the terrain of the enemy's land with a clarity that felt unnervingly like memory. He was preparing to invade a country he had never seen, yet he knew where the shadows would lie deepest, where the mountain passes were narrowest, where the sun would strike first at dawn. His mother watched him, her face a canvas of pride and terror. She saw the leader he had become, but she also saw the inexorable pull of a destiny she had fled from 2 decades ago. One evening, as he pored over maps by candlelight, she entered his study, a small, leather-bound journal in her hands. She placed it on the table beside him. "I should have told you everything long ago," she said softly. "But I wanted to protect you from his shadow. I see now that was impossible." He looked up, his eyes questioning. "This was his," she said, her fingers resting on the journal. "He gave it to me. It's filled with his thoughts. Histories of his kingdom, strategies, philosophies. I never read it. I couldn't bear to. But you are marching to face him. Perhaps you should understand the mind of your enemy." Alaric stared at the book. The mind of his enemy. The monster who had broken his mother's heart. He felt a sudden, violent revulsion. "I don't need to understand him. I only need to defeat him." "No, Alaric," Ilara said, her voice firm. "To defeat a monster, you must first understand why it is a monster. Or if it is a monster at all." She turned and left him alone with the journal. For a long while, he did not touch it. It felt like a betrayal. But as the night wore on, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, a pull he could not name, won out. He opened the book. The handwriting was elegant, precise. It was not the mad scrawling of a tyrant, but the careful, contemplative prose of a scholar, a king burdened by history. He began to read, and as he did, the simple, clear lines of his righteous war began to blur. He was reading the words of his father. The march into the gloomwood was a descent into another world. The sun, which had been a constant, benevolent companion in the open plains of the Sunlands, became a distant, fractured thing, its light struggling to pierce the dense, black-leafed canopy. The air grew cold and damp, smelling of rich soil, decay, and something else, a faint, metallic scent like old blood or ozone. The world became a place of deep shadows and unsettling silence, broken only by the tramp of thousands of boots and the jangle of armor. Alaric rode at the head of the column, his senses on fire. While his human soldiers saw only a dark, foreboding forest, he saw more. He could feel the ancient, dormant life in the trees around them, a slumbering consciousness that resented their intrusion. He could hear the scuttling of creatures in the undergrowth that no human ear could detect. This land was not dead, it was waiting. It felt familiar. A disquieting resonance hummed in his blood, a feeling of coming home to a place he'd never been. He glanced back at his army. It was a river of steel and leather flowing through the oppressive dark, torches held aloft creating small, brave pools of light. He saw the faces of his soldiers, pale and grim in the flickering light. He saw Jorik, his sparring partner, his hand resting on the hilt of his silvered sword, his eyes scanning the trees with a nervous energy. He saw farmers and merchants, men who had been selling grain or crafting furniture a month ago, now marching into the heart of their oldest nightmare. Their courage was a fragile, precious thing, and it was entirely dependent on him. They trusted him. They believed in his strength, in his otherness, as if he were a charm against the dark. The weight of that faith was heavier than any armor. "How can you stand the quiet?" Jorik muttered, riding his horse up alongside Alaric's. "It feels wrong. Like the whole forest is holding its breath." "It is," Alaric replied, his voice low. "It's listening. Stay alert." He had spent the nights leading up to the march devouring the journal. His father's journal. It was a strange and disturbing experience, like looking into a distorted mirror. He read of Kaelin's struggles with his own court, his frustration with their stagnation, his deep-seated belief that immortality without change was a curse. He read battle analyses and tactical treatises that were so brilliant, so insightful, that Alaric found himself unconsciously adopting their principles. He was learning how to defeat the vampire king from the king himself. But it was the personal entries, few and far between, that haunted him. He read of a walled garden, of the scent of moon petals, of a mortal woman whose laughter was the only true light in a kingdom of shadows. He read of a profound loneliness, the isolation of a being who had outlived everyone and everything he had ever cared for. The monster was being given a voice, a history, a heart. And Alaric hated it. It complicated the pure, clean lines of his anger. It made his quest for justice feel dangerously like a son's tantrum against a father he was only just beginning to know. He shut the book, but he couldn't shut out the words. They were a part of him now, tangled up with his mother's grief and his own righteous fury. They made camp the first night in a small, defensible clearing. Huge bonfires were lit, pushing back the oppressive darkness. The men huddled close, their talk subdued, their laughter strained. Alaric walked the perimeter, his senses stretched to their limit. He felt the vampires long before he saw them. A subtle shift in the cold air, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, the feeling of being watched by hungry eyes. "Perimeter," he roared, his voice cutting through the camp's low hum. "Archers to the line." The attack came without a sound. Not a charge, but an infiltration. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the trees. They were blurs of motion, silent and deadly, moving between the sentries with impossible speed. An alarm cry was cut short with a wet gurgle. Alaric was already moving. He met the first vampire as it lunged for an archer, his silver cord blade a streak of light. The creature, ancient and powerful, was not expecting him. It was not expecting a human to be so fast. Alaric's sword bit deep into its shoulder. The vampire hissed, its fangs bared, its eyes glowing with a feral red light. It was strong, its grip on his sword arm like iron, but Alaric was stronger. With a roar that was not entirely human, he twisted the blade and shoved the vampire back into the light of the bonfire. Its scream was horrifying as the blessed flames touched its skin. It erupted in a pyre of black fire, dissolving into ash in seconds. The camp exploded into chaos, but it was a trained chaos. Alaric's drills had prepared them for this. Shield walls formed, ranks of spearmen held their ground, and archers rained silver-tipped arrows into the darkness. The vampires were used to panicked, fleeing prey. They were not prepared for a disciplined, standing army. Alaric moved through the battle like a storm. He was everywhere at once, his blade a whirlwind of silver death, his preternatural senses allowing him to anticipate every strike, to see every feint. He was not just defending his men, he was a predator in his own right, hunting the hunters in their own domain. He felt a savage joy in it, a dark and exhilarating power that pulsed in time with his strange, hybrid heartbeat. For the first time in his life, he was not holding back. He was unleashing the entirety of his unnatural self, and it was glorious and terrifying. The vampires, disorganized and shocked by the ferocity of the resistance, broke and fled, melting back into the shadows from which they came. The battle had lasted less than 10 minutes. Silence descended once more, broken by the panting breaths of the soldiers and the groans of the wounded. They had won. They had faced the night's terrors and held the line. Alaric stood over the ashes of a fallen vampire, his sword dripping with black, viscous blood. His men were staring at him, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. In the heat of the battle, they had not just seen their commander. They had seen something else. Something not quite human. The ghost. The shadow. The monster who fought for them. He looked at their faces and saw the gulf between them widening. In proving he was their salvation, he had also proven he was not one of them. The familiar ache of isolation returned, sharper than ever. He was leading them into the dark, but he was walking it alone. The first true battle took place at the foothills of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, on a long, sloping field of grey scree known as the Weeping Plain. It was a desolate place, perpetually shrouded in mist from the cold mountain rivers. This was the vampires' chosen ground. Here, the mists would diffuse the morning sun, giving them precious extra hours to fight before they had to retreat to their shadowed burrows. General Cassian of the Third Coven watched the human army assemble from a high ridge. He was 4 centuries old, a veteran of countless brutal campaigns against rival vampire clans and the occasional, suicidal human uprising. He had never seen anything like this. This was not a panicked mob of peasants with torches. This was an army. They formed disciplined ranks, their shields interlocked, their spear points gleaming. They had cavalry, archers, and siege engines they were painstakingly hauling up the rocky inclines. And at their head, on a black warhorse, sat the Sunstone commander. Even from this distance, Cassian could feel the sheer force of the man's will, a palpable aura of command. He had heard the reports from the Gloomwood skirmish, had dismissed them as the exaggerations of cowards. Lord Valerus, fallen? Impossible. But now, seeing the silent, disciplined force arrayed below, a sliver of doubt entered Cassian's ancient, confident mind. They are bold, he murmured to his second-in-command, a younger, more eager vampire named Serafina. I will grant them that. Their commander has taught them how to stand and die with honor. Let us grant them the opportunity, Serafina hissed, her red eyes gleaming with anticipation. The mist is thick. The sun is a pale ghost. We can break them before the noon hour. Cassian nodded. Send the outriders. Harass their flanks. Test their nerve. The main assault will begin when their formation begins to fray. Down on the plain, Alaric felt the shift in the atmosphere. The mist was not just water vapor, it was a cloak for his enemy. He could feel them, hundreds of them, moving on the ridges above, their cold presences like pinpricks against his skin. Archers, he commanded, his voice carrying easily across the field. Volley fire on the high ground to the east and west. Probing. Don't waste your silver tips. A hail of arrows soared into the mist, followed by faint, surprised hisses and the clatter of armor on rock. The harassment from the flanks would be blunted. He had read about this tactic in the journal. Never allow the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement. Force them to react to you, even when you are on the defensive. The vampire's main assault came as he knew it would, a silent, terrifying wave of speed and darkness pouring down the slopes. They moved with a liquid grace that was mesmerizing, closing the distance in a fraction of the time a human army could. Shields. Alaric roared. Hold the line. First rank, brace. Second rank, spears. The impact was brutal. The vampire charge hit the human shield wall like a physical blow. The sound was a sickening crunch of metal and bone, the screams of men mingling with the inhuman snarls of the vampires. The front line buckled, but it did not break. Alaric's training held. The men fought with a desperate, disciplined ferocity, their silvered weapons finding their marks. Alaric himself was not behind the lines, directing. He was in the thick of it. He had ridden his horse into the deadliest part of the fray, his sword a blur of motion. He was a beacon of hope in the chaos, his presence shoring up the courage of his men. He moved with a speed that matched the vampires, his strength overwhelming them. He fought with a cold, focused fury, his twilight eyes missing nothing. Cassian watched from the ridge, his disbelief turning to cold dread. The commander was not human. It was the only possible explanation. No mortal could move like that, fight like that. He was a whirlwind of destruction, cutting down ancient warriors as if they were fresh fledglings. He saw the commander parry a blow from one of his best lieutenants and reply with a shield bash of such force that the vampire's chest caved in. It was impossible. He is the center, Cassian realized aloud. Their entire formation, their courage, it all hinges on him. If he falls, they will shatter. He drew his own blade, a magnificent piece of obsidian-forged steel. Seraphina, take the left flank. Pin them. I will deal with the commander myself. He descended the slope like an avalanche, his speed far surpassing that of his soldiers. He carved a path through the human ranks, men falling before him, their weapons seeming to pass through him like smoke. He was a general, a lord of the night, and his power was absolute. He moved with the weight of 400 years of slaughter. Alaric felt his approach, a sudden vortex of cold and ancient power in the chaos of the battle. He turned just as Cassian lunged, the obsidian blade aimed at his heart. Alaric's sword came up, the clash of silver-blessed steel against vampire-forged obsidian ringing out over the din of battle. The force of the blow sent a shockwave up Alaric's arm that would have shattered the bones of a normal man. The two commanders stood face to face, blades locked. Cassian's eyes, burning red pits of ancient hatred, widened in shock as he looked into Alaric's. He saw the impossible color, the violet gray of dusk. And in the lines of the young man's face, in the fierce set of his jaw, he saw a ghost. A face he had not seen in 20 years, but had never forgotten. The face of his king. It cannot be, Cassian breathed, his voice a rasp of disbelief. The shock gave Alaric the opening he needed. He shoved Cassian back, breaking the blade lock, and followed with a swift, powerful kick to the vampire's chest. Cassian staggered, caught off balance not by the blow, but by the revelation. Alaric pressed his attack, his movements fluid, relentless. He was fighting on instinct, his body moving faster than his mind could command. He was pure predator, his hybrid nature singing in his veins. He saw an opening in Cassian's guard and drove his sword home. The silver-cord blade slid through the ancient vampire's mail and deep into his chest. Cassian gasped, a look of profound astonishment on his face. He stared at Alaric, at the impossible face of his king's son, the rumored, prophesied child. The ruin, Cassian choked, black blood bubbling from his lips. Has come. He collapsed, dissolving into a cloud of swirling ash and dust. The vampires around them saw their general fall. A collective, psychic shock went through their ranks. Their invincible commander, their ancient lord, was gone. Their morale shattered. The charge faltered, and then it became a rout. They fled, melting back into the mists, leaving their dead and the field to the humans. The human army erupted in a ragged, exhausted cheer. They had done it. They had met a vampire legion on their own ground and won. Alaric stood panting in the center of the carnage, leaning on his sword. He looked at the pile of ash that had been General Cassian, the vampire's last words echoing in his mind. The ruin has come. He felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow ache. He had proven he could kill them. He had proven he was stronger. But in the vampire's dying eyes, he had seen not just fear, but recognition. And it was a recognition that chilled him to the bone. The general had looked at him and seen something other than an enemy. He had seen a prince. News of the defeat at the Weeping Plain traveled fast. It moved through the Night Kingdom like a tremor, shaking the foundations of a society that had not known a true military threat for centuries. General Cassian, dead. An entire coven decimated. Slain by a human army led by a commander who fought like a demon, a commander with the eyes of the king. Kaelan received the news in his private observatory at the highest point of the citadel. He was not looking at the stars, but down at the world of men, a patchwork of tiny, flickering lights in the vast darkness. The report was delivered by a trembling scout, one of the few survivors of Cassian's legion. The young vampire could not meet his king's eyes as he recounted the battle, his voice cracking as he described the commander's impossible speed and strength. And his face, "My king," the scout stammered, finally daring a glance upward. When General Cassian fell, he looked upon the commander's face and spoke a word. Ruin. Kaelan's expression was unreadable, carved from marble. He had been still for so long that the scout wondered if he was even breathing. The king dismissed him with a flick of his fingers, and the terrified vampire scrambled from the room, leaving Kaelan alone with the silence and the distant, mocking lights of the human world. He had known this was coming. He had felt it in the shifting tides of power, in the very air of his kingdom. But the reality of it was a physical blow. Alaric. His son. He had not merely survived in the sun, he had thrived. He had become a leader, a warrior, a force capable of shaking the oldest foundations of the night. Kaelan felt a surge of fierce, terrible pride, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was followed immediately by a wave of profound dread. This was the prophecy twisting into its final, ironic shape. The child was not bringing ruin through corruption from within, but through righteous fury from without. He was coming to destroy a father he did not know, to avenge a mother whose pain he could only guess at. He was the kingdom's doom, and he was Kaelan's own creation, forged in the fires of a desperate, cruel choice made 2 decades ago. He walked to the long, arched window, his hand resting on the cold stone. He could feel the boy's army, a slow-moving tide of warmth and life, drawing ever closer to his borders. He could feel Alaric's anger, a focused, burning point of light in the darkness. His council would demand a response. They would call for the full might of the vampire legions to be unleashed. They would want to crush this human uprising, to slaughter them to the last man and make an example of their audacious commander. Lycoris, the ancient elder, would be at the forefront, her voice a venomous whisper, urging him to eradicate the threat, never suspecting its true nature. But how could he? How could he send his armies to kill his own son? The son he had sacrificed everything to protect. The thought was a physical violation, a tearing in the fabric of his being. And yet, how could he not? He was the king. His first duty was to his people, to the kingdom he had ruled for 500 years. To show weakness now, to hesitate, would be to invite chaos. His rivals within the court would see it as an opportunity. The kingdom would fracture, consumed by civil war, a ruin far more complete than any human army could inflict. He was trapped between his crown and his blood, between his duty as a king and a father's impossible, long-buried heart. For 20 years, he had lived as a ghost in his own life, his emotions locked away, his existence a sterile performance of power. Now, that frozen sea was beginning to crack. The pride, the dread, the regret, and something else, a desperate, aching longing to see the boy's face, to look into the eyes that were a reflection of his own and Ilara's. He made a decision. It was not the decision of a king, but of a man pushed to the absolute limit. It was illogical, reckless, and flew in the face of every tradition of vampire warfare. It was a move his council would call madness. He summoned his royal guard, the 10 most powerful and loyal vampires in the kingdom. They appeared in his observatory in an instant, materializing from shadows, their red eyes glowing in the dim light. "My king," their captain, an ancient warrior named Lucian, asked, his voice a low rumble. "The human army marches on the Blackwood Pass," Kalen said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Their commander has proven formidable." He turned from the window, his twilight eyes sweeping over his guard. "The council will demand we meet them with overwhelming force. They will demand we make the rivers run red with human blood." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "We will do no such thing." Lucian's brow furrowed. "My king, I will ride to the Blackwood Pass myself," Kalen announced. "You 10 will be my only escort. We will meet this Sunstone commander. We will meet him under a flag of truce." A collective shock went through the guard. It was an unprecedented, unthinkable act. The king, parleying with a human? It was beneath his dignity, a sign of weakness that could shatter his authority. "Sire," Lucian began, his voice laced with concern, "to approach them in such a way, it is too great a risk. They will see it as an admission of fear. They may not honor a truce. It could be a trap." "The commander who defeated Kashan's legion is not a simple barbarian," Kalen said, his voice sharp with an authority that allowed no argument. "He is a strategist. He will understand the gesture. And if it is a trap," a faint, cold smile touched his lips, "then he will find that I am not so easily caught. He would not go to war with his son. Not yet. He would face him first. He would look into his eyes and see what had become of the tiny spark of life he had sent into the sun. He didn't know what he would say, what he could possibly offer. An apology felt like an insult after 20 years of silence. An explanation felt like an excuse. But he had to try. He had to stand before the ruin he had created and give it a name. He had to face his son, even if it meant his own destruction. It was the only choice he had left. The human army made camp in the shadow of the Blackwood Pass, a grim, jagged rent in the mountains that served as the final gateway to the heart of the Night Kingdom. The air was thin and cold, and the peaks on either side blotted out the sun for all but a few hours at midday. Morale was high after the victory at the Weeping Plain, but it was a brittle, nervous energy. They had blooded the monster, but now they were at its throat, and its teeth were bared. Alaric stood on a rocky outcrop, looking down the pass. He could feel the presence of the kingdom beyond, a vast, cold weight on his senses. Since the battle, the journal had become his constant companion. He read and reread the pages, searching for tactical weaknesses, but finding instead the shape of a man. A lonely, burdened, brilliant man. A king. A father. His anger was no longer a simple, righteous fire. It was a complex, smoldering thing, choked with confusion and a reluctant, painful empathy. He was marching to kill the man whose words had taught him strategy, whose philosophies resonated with his own lonely otherness. He felt as though he were marching against a part of himself. Jorik found him there, his face grim. "Commander." A rider from the forward scouts. "You need to see this." Alaric followed him to the edge of the camp. A scout was waiting, his horse lathered in sweat, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They're coming, sir," the scout said, his voice breathless. "A party of vampires. Under a white flag." Alaric's blood ran cold. A truce. Why? After the defeat at the Weeping Plain, he had expected a massive, overwhelming counterattack. This made no strategic sense. It was a sign of weakness, or a trick. "How many?" Alaric asked, his mind racing. "No more than a dozen, sir. But one of them, he rides at the front. The aura of him, it's like nothing I've ever felt. It has to be the king." The king. The words hung in the air, heavy with 20 years of his mother's pain, with the ghosts of Silver Creek, with the confusing weight of the journal. He was coming. Not with an army, but with a flag of truce. "Tell the men to stand down, but to remain on high alert," Alaric ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Archers on the ridges," Silvertip snarked. "If they make a single hostile move, I want the sky to rain silver. I will meet him. Alone." "Commander, no," Jorik protested. "It's a trap. Let us go with you." "If it's a trap, your presence won't make a difference against him," Alaric said, his gaze fixed on the mouth of the pass. "This is something I have to do." He swung himself onto his horse, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. This was it. The confrontation he had sought his entire life, but it was happening in a way he had never imagined. He had prepared for a battle of steel, not a battle of wills. He rode out alone, the eyes of his entire army on his back. As he rounded a bend in the pass, he saw them. 11 figures on black horses, waiting. 10 were clad in night-black armor, silent and still as statues. But the one at the front, he was different. He wore no helmet, and his clothes were the simple, dark garb of a traveler, not a king. His stillness was absolute, a vortex of power that seemed to suck the very sound from the air. As Alaric drew closer, he could see the king's face. And his breath caught in his throat. It was like looking at an older, harder, infinitely more weary version of himself. The same dark hair, the same line of the jaw, the same proud set of the shoulders. And the eyes. The eyes were identical. The color of twilight, holding the wisdom of centuries and a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical landscape. This was him. The nameless tyrant from his mother's stories. The brilliant strategist from the journal. The monster. His father. Alaric brought his horse to a halt 20 paces away. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken history, of a life not lived together, of a war that was both personal and political. The king's escort remained perfectly still, their faces hidden behind their helms, but Alaric could feel their lethal attention focused entirely on him. Cailan was the first to speak. His voice was not the monstrous roar Alaric had expected. It was quiet, calm, with a deep, melodic resonance. It was the voice from the journal. "You are the one they call the Sunstone Commander." It was a statement, not a question. "And you are the Vampire King," Alaric replied, his own voice tight, strained. He forced himself to see the tyrant, not the reflection in the mirror. "You came a long way to state the obvious." A flicker of something, amusement, pain, crossed the king's face. "I did not come here to fight you, Alaric." Hearing his name on the king's lips was a shock. It made this personal, intimate, in a way that felt like a violation. "You lost that privilege when you sent your butchers to Silver Creek." The raid on Silver Creek was an unauthorized atrocity, committed by a lord who overstepped his authority, Cailan said, his voice even. "He has already been turned to ash for it. But I will not pretend my kingdom is without guilt. We have preyed upon your people for centuries. It is our nature. A nature I am here to end." Alaric shot back, his hand tightening on his sword. "Why are you here? To beg for terms? You will get none. My army will not stop until your citadel is rubble." Cailan's gaze was intense, searching. He looked at Alaric, and for the first time, Alaric saw past the king. He saw a man, and that man was looking at him with an expression of such complex, agonizing emotion that it stole the breath from his lungs. There was regret, pride, and a deep, soul-shattering longing. "I have watched you your entire life," Cailan said softly, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. "I watched you take your first steps. I watched you learn to wield a sword. I watched you become the man you are today. A man who leads an army against his own father." The world tilted. The air rushed from Alaric's lungs. He had known, somewhere in the deepest parts of himself, since he'd first opened the journal, since he'd seen the king's face. But to hear the words spoken aloud, it was a physical blow. The truth, raw and undeniable, landed in the center of his chest and shattered everything. His righteous anger, his quest for justice, his entire identity, it was all built on a lie. Or rather, a truth he had never been allowed to know. "No," Alaric choked out, the word a raw denial. He shook his head, refusing it. "My father was a human. A soldier. He died before I was born." The lie his mother had told him, the one he had clung to his whole life, sounded hollow and pathetic now. "Your mother is a remarkable woman," Cailan continued, his voice gentle, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "She gave you a life, a world, I never could. She protected you, as I asked her to. As you asked her to." Alaric's shock curdled into a new, more potent rage. A rage born of betrayal not by an enemy, but by the very blood in his veins. You call that exile a request? You stood there and watched them cast her out. Helpless and pregnant. You abandoned her. You abandoned me. I saved you, Kaelan countered, and for the first time, a fire ignited in his twilight eyes, a flash of the immense power he held in check. Do you have any idea what they would have done to you? To her. A half-breed child, born to the king? You were the fulfillment of a prophecy that promised my kingdom's ruin. My court would have torn you apart before you drew your first breath. I sent you away not to abandon you, but to give you the one thing I could not, a life. A choice. The sun. Every word was a chisel, chipping away at the foundations of Alaric's world. He saw it all in a sickening flash of clarity, his mother's sorrow, her fear for him, her refusal to speak the name of the king. She hadn't been protecting herself from a painful memory. She had been protecting him from a dangerous truth. And he, in his arrogant quest for vengeance, had marched that truth right back to the gates of the kingdom she had fled. He looked at the man before him, the king, his father, and he felt a dizzying wave of conflicting emotions. The rage was still there, a white-hot fire, but now it was joined by a profound, aching grief for the life he never had, for the father he never knew. He saw the loneliness in Kaelan's eyes and recognized it as his own. He was looking at his past and his future, a monster and a mirror. You chose your throne, Alaric finally managed to say, his voice thick with unshed tears of rage and confusion. You chose your power over your family. You call it a sacrifice, but it looks like cowardice to me. The accusation struck home. Kaelan's impassive mask finally cracked, revealing the raw wound beneath. Yes, he whispered, the admission a ragged exhalation of 20 years of pain. Every single day, it has felt like cowardice. And every single day, I have told myself it was the only way. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Alaric. I do not deserve it. I ask you only to understand that this war between us is the one thing I gave up everything to prevent. He dismounted his horse, a gesture of profound vulnerability. He stood before his son, unarmed, his hands open at his sides. My kingdom is stagnant. It is dying a slow death of pride and tradition. The prophecy was right. You are its ruin. But perhaps ruin is another word for rebirth. This path ends with one of us dead and both our peoples devastated. But there may be another way. A way I was too much of a coward to see 20 years ago. He looked at Alaric, his kingly authority gone, replaced by the desperate, pleading gaze of a father. Help me save it. Help me save them from themselves. From me. Do not be the ruin that destroys us. Be the one that changes us. The armies waited. On one side of the Blackwood Pass, a river of human steel and hope held its breath. On the other, the silent, deathless legions of the night gathered, their crimson eyes glowing in the gloom, awaiting the command of their king. In the space between them, a son stared at his father, and the fate of two worlds hung suspended in the fragile, silent air. Alaric felt as if he were drowning. Kaelan's words, his plea, had stripped away the armor of his certainty, leaving him exposed and raw. The narrative of his life, the noble son avenging his wronged mother against a faceless tyrant, had dissolved into a far more painful and complex reality. The tyrant had a face, and it was his own. The monster had a heart, and it had been breaking for 20 years. He thought of his mother. He tried to summon the image of her, weeping and alone, cast out into the cold. But another image intruded, his mother in her garden, tending her moon petals, her expression soft with a sorrow that was not just for what she had lost, but perhaps for what he had lost as well. To defeat a monster, you must first understand why it is a monster. Or if it is a monster at all. She had known. She had tried to prepare him. His rage was a shield, and he clung to it. Change, he spat, the word tasting like acid. What change? You want me to lay down my arms and trust the man who abandoned my mother? You want me to tell my soldiers, the men who have lost brothers and sons to your kind, that it was all a misunderstanding? The people of Silver Creek are still ash. Your pretty words can't change that. No, they cannot, Kaelan agreed, his voice heavy with the admission. He did not flinch from Alaric's anger, he absorbed it, as if it were a penance he had long expected. The dead will remain dead. The grievances are real. I do not ask you to forget them. I ask you to look beyond them. You are the only one who can. You are of both worlds, Alaric. You carry the sun in your blood and the night in your eyes. You are the bridge that has never existed between our peoples. A bridge. Alaric had always felt like an outsider, a man caught between, belonging to neither. Now, his father was telling him that this very otherness was not a curse, but a purpose. He looked past Kaelin, at the 10 silent figures of the royal guard. They were watching him, their stillness a palpable threat. Then he looked back, over his shoulder, at the camp of his own army. He saw Jorik, waiting anxiously, a representative of all the trusting, mortal, fragile lives he had sworn to protect. To continue the war meant leading them to their deaths against an enemy that could not truly be conquered, only culled. To retreat meant leaving them vulnerable, betraying the promise of safety he had made. There was a third option. The one Kaelin was offering. A path that was not about victory or vengeance, but about something far more difficult, peace. A peace brokered by him. It was an impossible, terrifying thought. The burden of it was immense. What would this change look like? Alaric asked, the question feeling like a concession, a betrayal of his own anger. Hope flickered in Kaelin's eyes, a faint, fragile light. An end to the raids. A new treaty. The establishment of a joint council to govern the borderlands, made of both humans and vampires. A council where you would have a seat. Where your voice would be equal to my own. He took a step closer. I would abdicate my absolute authority. I would bind myself and my people to this new law. We would learn to coexist. Or we would perish together. It was a staggering proposal. For a king who had ruled for 5 centuries to offer to share his power, it was unthinkable. It was either a desperate lie or a genuine, revolutionary act. Looking into his father's eyes, Alaric saw the exhaustion, the deep, soul-weariness of a ruler who had come to the end of his own long, lonely road. He saw the truth. The decision rested on his shoulders. He could be the warrior who killed his father and potentially shattered the Night Kingdom into warring, chaotic factions far more dangerous than the unified whole. He could fulfill the prophecy of ruin. Or he could become something else. A builder. A diplomat. A son. He thought of the journal, of the king's lonely words about change and stagnation. He thought of his mother's quiet strength, which had always been in endurance and growth, not in destruction. He was the product of them both. The warrior and the gardener. The night and the day. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric sheathed his sword. The sound was deafening in the silence. It was an answer. A long, shuddering breath escaped Kaelin's lips. It was the sound of a weight, borne for 20 years, finally being set down. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for a fleeting moment, he looked not like a timeless king, but simply like a man, aged and relieved. Alaric turned his horse and rode back toward his camp, his mind a maelstrom. He did not look back at his father. The meeting was over, but the true battle, the battle for peace, had just begun. He would have to convince his own people, his own captains who were hungry for vengeance. He would have to face down the ancient prejudices of the vampires. He would have to learn to trust the man who was the source of all his pain. Weeks later, the first meeting of the new council was held in a hastily constructed pavilion in the Blackwood Pass, precisely on the border between the two lands. On one side sat the human delegation, led by a wary but resolute Alaric. On the other sat the vampire lords, their faces impassive masks that betrayed nothing, led by Kaelin. The tension was a living thing in the room. The negotiations were fraught, filled with centuries of mistrust and hatred. But they did not break down. Kaelin, true to his word, ceded points, his authority silencing the more aggressive factions of his court. And Alaric, with a wisdom that seemed to come from both his father's strategic mind and his mother's compassionate heart, argued for a peace that was just, not merely convenient. Slowly, painfully, an accord was hammered out. New borders were drawn. Trade agreements were made. A joint patrol of human soldiers and vampire warriors was established to keep the peace. It was a fragile, imperfect thing, this new world they were building, but it was a beginning. After one particularly grueling session, Alaric found himself standing alone on the pass at sunset, watching the long shadows stretch from the mountains of his father's kingdom to touch the plains of his mother's. He felt a cool presence beside him and turned to see Kaelin. They stood in silence for a long time, not as king and commander, but as father and son, watching the day bleed into night. "She would be proud of you," Kaelin said quietly. He had sent a message to Alara, a carefully worded letter of explanation and apology, carried by his most trusted messenger. He had received no reply. "She is a gardener," Alaric replied, his eyes on the horizon. "She knows that nothing new can grow in salted earth. Vengeance salts the earth." Kaelin nodded, accepting the veiled rebuke. "I have ruled for 500 years, he said, his voice a low murmur. "And in all that time, I have only ever maintained what was. I preserved. I endured.